Hello, everybody. Welcome to the XFL Strategy Show for Week 4. Another week here of XFL. Really an interesting league, one that continues to throw us curveballs, but hopefully one that we'll have a better sense of after a month of action. I'm Chris Spags, joined once again by my XFL buddy, the man who you want to tell you everything you need to know about these XFL players, Sal Vetri, at Sal Vetri DFS. How are you doing, Sal?
I'm doing good, man. Yeah, I'm excited. There's a bunch of news came in last night heading into this week. We probably will have even more news after the Friday practice reports. But yeah, looking forward to week 4.
Yeah, it's going to be another fun week here, and we do have a promo code going, which actually it probably would have helped if I noted in advance. But if you go right now to boy, let's take that over again. You go right now to osmo.com/join and use the promo code football is back. We have a discount on there for weekly packages. Got a bunch of packages right now at osmo.com. So, I went straight from doing the four corners into this video. So talking fast and for a short form video, now I'm going to talk normally for the XFL. Not the easiest transition, but anyway, osmo.com/join. Use the promo code football is back right now for some deals on our weekly packages over there. XFL projections and ownership projections are available for you. And last week, I guess we should do a quick little recap, Sal. Last week was a great week for profitability, but an absolutely terrible week for building lineups the way that we know to. If you did double stack Houston up, Phillip Walker, and Cam Phillips, pretty much any player would have killed that lineup for you right away. I guess my question for you, Sal, first of all, how did you make out in week 3? And also, how are you handling these teams moving forward? Because that went against everything we know from the NFL. You want to double stack your guys usually and run it back with a player. That was not the way to construct a lineup last week. So any findings for you, Sal?
Yeah, so week 3 was good for me. Week 1 and 3 were my best weeks yet. Week 2 was a small loss, but yeah, it was interesting. So I think just moving forward, and really this is the way that I've approached it so far. And I think we talked about it week 1, was just looking for one pass catcher without a doubt to get that correlation with your quarterback. And you just got the nut combo last week with Phillip Walker and Cam Phillips. And really it's just about lineup construction. Like there's only 4 games a week, and trying to really pinpoint down the game that goes off. And you have an ideal one this week, but it just starts to get a little bit difficult. They quickly priced up Houston after week 1. Even going into that week, they were expensive. So it really is hard to kind of double stack, and definitely run it back, because then you're putting all your eggs into one basket for a single team. And at that point, you're probably going to have players be just productive enough in other games. So yeah, the biggest thing for me just moving forward is continuing to really just stack one pass catcher and just try and prioritize that. Opening up a little bit more to 2 running back lineups, but even there, I'm still leaning more towards 1.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I do think there are a couple teams that do have running backs that are going to be appealing. Dallas in particular, we'll talk about in a real potential shootout here, possibly the biggest potential shootout of the week going against the aforementioned Houston team. But we will talk about it all. But yeah, I'm with you on that. I do think 1-in-1 stacks seem like more of a move. Also, just worth noting right now, our projections for week 4 have been updated. So Nolan, don't have to slack me during the show, buddy. I got the podcast recording thing going. System. We're doing enough here at 2 laptops. But anyway, we are going to have the podcast feed also going for the XFL show going. So if you want to subscribe to the Osmo podcast as well, we are doing the XFL show on there too. So if you want an audio only version, make sure to check that out. Always good to get notifications during a show. All right, so projections are up. Let's talk about game 1 here, Sal. We got Game 1 is going to be Los Angeles and New York, and you were telling me about some of the injury updates for Los Angeles. We knew earlier in the week that Nelson Spruce is going to be out after being a high-volume guy earlier in the week, and now we get a situation here where really it's hard to tell what's going to happen. Trey Mcbride ran 11 routes in his debut, was targeted insanely high relative to that volume, had a monster day there with 2 scores. What are you feeling here about the injury situation for Los Angeles? Let's talk the wide receivers first. Do you think Mcbride gets a gigantic boost with Spruce? Do you think a guy like Levante Whitfield gets more run out of the slot? How do you feel like this one's going to go down?
Yeah, so Nelson Spruce is going to be out. And I think the thing that's positive is Mcbride has been dealing with a thigh injury. That's what he's currently on the injury report with, but listed probable. But it seemed like he had, and they were saying murmurs after that he sustained a concussion in that game when he left in the 3rd quarter. He only landed 11 routes. He was on pace to run about 16. They didn't really throw it a lot, so it wasn't actually as less usage as it might seem, but still was going to be like the 3rd or 4th guy in routes run on the team for that week. But now you have the number 1 player on the team in routes run and one of the tops in the league in Nelson Spruce out. And Mcbride is listed probable for the first time all year. We had him as a game time decision for the past 2 weeks, played last week, not the week before. So I do think Mcbride's interesting. Now, DraftKings priced him up, which makes it a little bit more difficult. I'd rather get there in GPPs instead of cash games. But he's not going to be the guy, in my opinion, who sees just the ultimate boost. He'll have ownership. He was priced up. He had the big game last week. But yeah, I think that Whitfield's actual opportunity is going to change. So a lot of the times, and it translates from the NFL being pretty much the same sport, you get a situation where just the opportunity that's changing is the thing you want to target. Now, anybody who fills in for Nelson Spruce is probably going to be a huge skill gap drop. But yeah, Whitfield, I think he's second on the team right now in routes run out of the slot. Adonis Jennings is third there. You had Trey McBride running 3 out of the slot last week. So I think Whitfield is the one who sees the biggest opportunity change. That said, you might see like a 1 or 2 target uptick for Jordan Smallwood and McBride. So McBride's in playing GPPs for me. Whitfield more of a deeper option just because you don't have to roster a ton of guys in the XFL salary format.
Yeah, Whitfield just jumped out as a guy who did get some of those slot routes, though. It does seem like he's been getting the routes when the games have mostly been out of control. McBride did run 3 slot routes in that game there. And, for him, if he's running 11 routes and he got 3 of his routes out of the slot, it does seem like he could at least see some work there. But I agree, a GPP play for sure. Definitely not a cash game play by any stretch. We talked a little bit about the running backs before we came on the air, Sal, and I guess we should talk about them before we even talk about Josh Johnson. People are going to see that Martez Carter really went nuts in that last game. It's weird. His stats, another stat discrepancy I saw. PFF had him for 41 rushing, 41 receiving. The XFL site had him for 34 rushing, 41 receiving. But either way, a good day because he had 3 touchdowns there after Elijah Hood was a late scratch. But Sal, update us on the injuries here and Martez Carter and Hood, who apparently both having some issues with practice this week.
Yeah, so Carter's going to be doubtful with an ankle injury. And then Elijah Hood, who was sort of a late scratch last week, right before the game and unexpected inactive, he wasn't on the injury report all week. He's still not on the XFL's official injury report, but it came out via Twitter that he's questionable. So a little bit murky there. But what that leaves you, let's just say Elijah Hood doesn't play, is Larry Rose and then Juwan Harris in the backfield. Rose has been playing ahead of Harris. He was a very good college pass catching back. He's sort of been that role on this team when Carter wasn't in the mix. So if you get no Elijah Hood, I do think that it makes Larry Rose in play as just a punt option at running back. He's in the 3K range. He allows you to get up to the pairings of Philip Walker plus Cam Phillips if you want to be doing that and spending all the way up. So he's not a high upside play, but he's just a very cheap play if Hood is going to be out.
Yeah, I mean, the pass game work that Carter got last week was, I think, a little more encouraging if we are going to see Rose in the mix without Hood. Rose has been a guy who's actually been running some routes already, but Carter ran 14 routes in that game, which not a bad number by XFL running back standards. At the price point for Rose, we saw that last week where I guess, if there is just going to be one guy in there who is a pass catcher, it's probably a better role than Hood's actually had for himself. So I think Rose is kind of an appealing play there. And a guy, too, frankly, I wouldn't mind even stacking up with Josh Johnson, given the fact that they really did throw the running back a little more in a meaningful way. But Sal, let's talk Josh Johnson here. Are you willing to go to him this week? He was the number 2 QB last week in a spot against DC where people really expected them to get killed at home. Instead, they went it the other way where really they just smoked DC in a way that was kind of shocking, and the defense looked a million times better. But Josh Johnson here, what are you doing with him? How are you feeling?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get here this week. He was my number 1 quarterback last week. I ended up having more of him than Walker, which wasn't ideal, but didn't end up sinking me because he had a fine game. But Josh Johnson this week, you get the price point's coming up. He's not running. I'm not even sure if it's injury related at this point because he just looked pretty fine last week. Just didn't show any urgency to run, no design runs. And the biggest thing is where the price point is. Nelson Spruce was kind of finally probably the nail in the coffin getting that news earlier in the week. I had him in a player pool, but then I just dropped him out of it because we're going to get to that game in Houston and DC. I'm interested a lot in both of those quarterbacks. So it just comes down to trying to prioritize where I want to go. You have Landry Jones, Cardell Jones, even cheaper than Josh Johnson this week. I think I'm just not going to get there as much at this price point.
Are you buying into Los Angeles as being, at least in the last that I updated the Vegas totals here, 7.5 point favorite on the road? I mean, New York has looked bad, but it does kind of seem like Los Angeles is a very volatile team with how they perform so far. Do you think that spread seems appropriate to you?
So the thing is like New York's defense and offense just all around, they've been terrible. They're the worst ranked defense right now, and LA's clicking on all cylinders on offense, but they did just lose Spruce. And now New York, Matt McGloin's out this week. They're expected to start Luis Perez, but it's not guaranteed. So in a spot like this, especially when you're at home, you're missing probably your best or second best, right, with Josh Johnson, offensive player for LA. And now you're facing a team that you really don't know what to expect out of new quarterback play because McGloin's been pretty terrible. So yeah, I would not be like, if I was to bet on this game, I would take the New York side because of all the uncertainty going into it.
No, I think that seems fair. And we did see all the quarterbacks getting work last week a little bit. So let's talk about this New York side. Perez is a guy who does come with a decent pedigree. He only had a handful of dropbacks there through 5 completions, 5 completions. No, I think I might have this backwards, but 5 pass attempts ish, let's say, and 83% accuracy on them. So he's a dude who did look better in very limited mop-up action. Marquis Williams, a guy who does have the rushing upside more. I guess, do you have a lean at all with these guys? Because I do think Perez has the ability and the price point to maybe make it worthwhile, but perhaps not if Los Angeles' coverage group looks as good as they did last week. They got a massive jump from PFF in their coverage grade.
Yeah, if I was to pick one of the New York guys, it would be Perez. But just the way that this slate is breaking out, you have a couple of other $7,000 quarterbacks that offer value if that's where you want to punt at. I would probably get to Taylor Cornelius before Perez if he was to start. You also have Perez going to definitely be competing with Williams during the game, similar to what you've seen in Tampa with Quentin Flowers as of late, except now Quentin Flowers isn't going to be playing and competing with Cornelius. So when it comes to punting the quarterbacks, I'm not that interested in doing it this week, but I would rather lean to getting to Cornelius before any of these New York guys.
Well, you're mentioning Cornelius. I thought Aaron Murray was going to be back.
So Aaron Murray has been practicing, but they listed Aaron Murray as a starter earlier in the week. And then later in the week, there was an official report that they're going to stick with Taylor Cornelius and Quentin Flowers isn't going to be with the team for the foreseeable future.
Oh, I did not see that. Okay, so interesting. I would have thought Aaron Murray deserved another shot, but
Yeah. And
yeah.
I think the biggest thing, so like just in general, the quarterback seems sketchy. Like Perez he's not in a player pool for me, but he looks somewhat interesting. It's just that Marquis Williams is the issue. But yeah, the issue for Cornelius is that like he looked fine last week, and at 7K, if you were to punt it, it's not a terrible option with Quinn Flowers not in there. But if he struggles for like a quarter and a half, there's a great chance that Murray just comes right into the game. So it's more of a GPP play, but either way, like punting at quarterback is just seeming really risky this week.
Yeah, I think if we knew that Perez was starting, I'd be willing to take a stab there personally. I mean, really, I think I will probably have some exposure to both these guys just because I'm an idiot like that, and I had exposure to Matt McGloin, and might as well keep going down with the ship for New York as they look like the most dysfunctional team in the league by far. I guess we still have to talk about the wide receivers here, and I do think the wide receivers would gain more appeal if Luis Perez were starting. Again, just a dude who's got a bit of a better pedigree overall than Williams, who's more of a dual threat, kind of a Quentin Flowers type player, not the most accurate, but does have pretty good legs. Perez more of a prototypical pocket passer type dude. But Mikhail McKay here, Colby Pearson. I don't know if Joe Horn's going to be back in there this week, but how are you feeling about the New York receiving core? Are you going to have any of these guys at all? Because McKay seems like he's been getting the opportunity well enough. He's just been doing nothing with it because quarterback play has been so bad.
Yeah, it's a problem. Like he has a ton of air yards, McKay, but he's the only one running consistent routes. It's just not a situation where I want to get to them. You can take it two ways with the change of quarterbacks, and Marquis Williams is not going to help his wide receivers, more of a scrambler, and he should be in the game for parts of it. So that's not great. But Luis Perez maybe has upside to be a lot more accurate, especially on deep balls than we've seen out of Matt McGloin so far this year. But I'm probably going to lean to get away from it. You still have a price point that's rather expensive right now for McCall for what he's been playing under in this team at 8,000, and nothing else really stands out. Austin Duke was actually still the backup slot receiver last week, even with Joe Horn out. They actually ran Colby Pearson in the slot, and he just got a lot of blowout run. That's where he had a couple of receptions in the touchdown on that touchdown drive. So right now I have none of these receivers in my player pool. I only have one New York player in my player pool.
Interesting. So, okay, so you're really not going there. Who's the one New York player? I'm going to assume it's one of the running backs then because you're not as bullish on the receivers.
Yeah, so and he's barely in here, but it's Darius Viktor. It's only GPPs just because he's cheap and should see like 10 touches.
Okay, yeah, that seems fair. We've liked Viktor a lot, I feel like, on this show over the last few weeks. He hasn't quite spiked an upside. The price is still reasonable. Definitely getting more work than Tim Cook. I guess while we're talking the running backs here, how are you feeling about Justin Stockton? Because, I mean, he was part of why Luis Perez had some of the success in the pass game. Stockton got targeted a lot there while not running a bunch of routes, kind of in the garbage time primarily. But he has been a guy who's been touted as being a pretty good pass-catching back. Do you see him getting more work here? Is he interesting at all? Because it feels like with Viktor healthy in the game, not in a blowout, it does seem like he would get more of that work. But the fact that they're integrating Stockton at all does seem kind of encouraging.
Yeah, I think it is encouraging. You ended up seeing Tim Cook only play about 38% of the snaps. He looked like he got banged up at one point, so I'm not sure if that impacted it. But Stockton last week, he was just involved in the receiving game, but it was pretty much like every single time he was on the field, he was seeing a target because he still played around just 10% of the snaps or so. So he was on the field and he was encouraging when he was on there. But I just think right now, this backfield, if anything would be Viktor for me. But that's about it.
Okay, no, it seems fair. And definitely a New York team, not a great team total here. Not a great situation with them with how they've played so far. Also, just not running a lot of plays. Just everything looks bad for New York. And the Matt McGloin buying while there was blood in the street strategy did not pay off. But emotionally, it did. Felt very satisfying to try that out. But 15.8 implied points for New York doesn't seem like the best spot to target. Speaking of bad spots to target, and especially, I guess, this week in particular, Seattle at home, I'm willing to take stabs at. Seattle on the road getting 13.8 implied points from Vegas as an 11-point dog to a St. Louis team who's been pretty good. Seems like not the best, but we got Brandon Silvers in here. And I guess, Sal, if you want to take us through any news and notes, how are you feeling about Seattle's team and anything noteworthy here with the injuries or anything you've seen with the practices this week?
Yeah, so the biggest things for Seattle is that Kayshawn Williams is just still not going to play it this week with a quad injury. He was listed as a starter going into week 1, but he has yet to play a game. So this is now the 4th straight week that he's missed. That's really it from a fantasy skill position perspective, and just major news defensively. But yeah, you touched on the biggest thing, the lowest implied team total. When I was doing these odds, I thought I had just like a faulty website I was using, 13.25, just brutal. Like, I'm not going to have any interest in Brandon Silvers there. Seattle or St. Louis actually is fine in their secondary as well, ranking 2nd. But yeah, it's a gross team that's rather healthy, but when you're implied to not even score just 2 touchdowns in this game or right around that, it's a pretty gross situation.
Yeah, it's just a team where at home, I mean, look, that Seattle crowd, to their credit, I feel like really bringing a 12th man thing as much as they can to will those guys to look competent at home. Going to St. Louis, another team too, did feel like they had a real home field advantage last week. That crowd was fired up to have football back there. I just don't really see it for Seattle. I do think one guy I don't mind, though, Austin Parole. We talked a couple times about Darius Hillary, and his stats still a little bit inflated for some of the bad performances he had in week 1, I believe in particular, but still a guy who's really not giving up or not getting enough of attention for just being a poor corner in the slot, giving up a 1.6 yards per coverage snap, a 108 QB rating. I do think Austin Parole, with him to me looking like a better receiver than Keenan Reynolds, I think Parole's interesting enough. The price point definitely high. Some other high price guys who I would consider more of a priority. But Austin Parole, to me, I do think is in the mix, and Keenan Reynolds still getting deep shots. I'm willing to take stabs on those guys, definitely not stacked with Silvers given how bad he's looked and how competent the St. Louis team has looked. But in the past game, Sal, will you have a one-off guy? Would you go to Parole or Reynolds, or are you just mostly staying away from everything?
So I agree everything with what you said on Parole. He looks like the favorite target right now of Silvers. Coming out of the slot, he has the high upside and probably the best matchup in the slot. It's just a pricing thing for me, though. When he's in the prices ranges of guys like just Badet, Ross, Khalil Lewis, to an extent, Trey McBride, just those guys, it makes it a little bit more difficult to get there. You've seen him be successful, though, and I doubt he really picks up any ownership around those guys. So, yeah, in GPPs, I think it's interesting. Not overall interest. I guess the one guy that I can call out is a guy that is in a player pool for me right now, and this can definitely change depending on injury news, but Alonzo Moore did play 79% of the snaps for Seattle last week. He ran 26 routes after not playing in week 2. Only saw 5 targets, but he's just $3,000. So it's really a price play at that point, mainly because of the price points of Phillips and Philip Walker this week. If you want to play those guys together, you're going to have to punt somewhere, and it's probably going to be at wide receiver. So he's like one of the 3 or 4 $3,000 receivers that I think at least has a pulse.
No, that makes sense. And yeah, I still would have a hard time getting away from the core guys here. It does seem like it's really a Parole and Reynolds workload, but value is value. And it does make sense to target a guy maybe who's been out there enough. And St. Louis, too, a competent defense. You would think they know to really try to stop Parole, really try to limit Reynolds. Could open things up for more downfield a little bit more. We should just talk about the running backs here real fast. 3-headed monster here with Farrell, Williams, and Gardner. It seems like no guys really defining themselves in a meaningful way. I'm not going to play any of these guys, Sal, but do you have any interest in any of them?
Yeah, no, I don't. And even like so Larry Rose would be the punt running back, even if maybe Elijah Hood is in above these guys. So yeah, they're just in a 3-headed backfield right now that is pretty much clear cut down the middle, right around 35 snaps a piece, right around 8 to 12 touches. So in theory, one of those guys can get in the end zone. It seems like the best usage for the passing game is Trey Williams right now. So if you're going to pick one, it'd be him. But yeah, no real interest. None of them are in a player pool for me.
Okay, yeah, no, we're in agreement there. It's just, I think the guys are all individually decently talented, especially Farrell and Williams, but if you're going to be splitting carries as evenly as these guys have and routes and everything, just hard for one of those guys to pop in a meaningful way, especially going against St. Louis. Let's talk St. Louis, though. Last week, Jordan Ta'amu really looked like a play who could be viable, but we talked about some of the risk of it being a situation where St. Louis doesn't want to run a lot or doesn't want to pass a lot. They're going to run predominantly more than anything. They're at a 58% run rate on the year, and Ta'amu just didn't do anything in that spot. Just didn't have to do anything against a team that was pretty overmanned. This spot here, I think it's the same situation again. I don't see myself getting to Ta'amu much. The guys barely ran routes there. Nobody ran more than 20 routes in the receiving core. It does seem like the running game is going to be the main factor here again. But Sal, do you have any interest here in Ta'amu, or are you mostly staying away again after what we saw last week?
Yeah, I'm going to stay away again at this point, especially now that I think this is the biggest spread we've seen throughout the first 3-4 weeks now of the XFL. So I'm going to stay away from it. You touched on it. They're running like 58 to 60% of the time at this point. It's just really unappealing. You've seen Matt Jones pretty much be questionable for every game since week 1 so far. So I expect him to play. He's been on the injury report. But if for some reason he was like a late scratch, well, then maybe you have a little bit more interest in playing Ta'amu. Maybe they throw a little bit more, but they still have enough running backs on this roster to get it done on the ground. And they're built to do that at this point. They're not even, so right now in like most of their formations are just 2 wide receiver sets, which makes sense since they're running so much, but that's just the way that they're built, the way that their receivers block. So yeah, I have none of him right now, and I didn't even rank him, so I'm not that interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think the talent's there. If there's any way at all that Seattle maybe pushes the action, I think that's certainly a way that he gets there, but it's hard to see that outcome. As Sal mentioned, it's just a gigantic 11-point spread favoring St. Louis here. And Seattle, again, I really think they've been getting a big boost from being at home, being on the road in a hostile environment with another crowd who's going to really bring it and really be engaged in this game in a meaningful way. I do think is not the spot for Seattle. Run game here, though. Matt Jones getting the workload. Christine Michael also getting some touchdown equity, getting a little bit less workload, a little bit less of a snap share. I think both guys are still in play again, and we talked about it last week. I did take the discount for Michael a little bit more than Matt Jones, which ended up not being the best play, but still mostly fine because it got me to the Cam Phillips Philip Walker builds rather that I needed to get to. I don't mind Michael again, but I do think I'm going to try to get heavier on Jones this week. How are you feeling about these guys, Sal? Do you have a lean between Jones and Michael, or are you mostly treating them like the better price is going to be good in some lineups, or the better projection is going to be good in others?
Yeah, I think I still lean Michael just because of the price difference, but it's not that crazy. The issue for these guys is like they're running a ton, so that's what helps, and their offense runs a lot of plays. But the downside is just the fact that they're so ineffective. Their run game overall is the 7th best rated in the league. They have an average offensive line, and they don't see targets. They don't really run that many routes, like around 10 or 11 per game each. So their upside is not as much there outside of the running game. Now they have a 12-point spread here. So for this game specifically, it should be fine for 12 plus, probably 15 plus touches a piece overall. So I think they're both in play. I'll lean Michael. I think they both have the red zone upside. They've both been used pretty heavily in the red zone. So both in play. They start to push like top 3 options at running back this week, top 5 for sure.
Yeah, it seems to me, and this might be a little eye test thing, looking at the numbers, though, there really isn't a big appreciable difference. I guess enough. I mean, yards after contact, Matt Jones getting 2.9, Christine Michael getting 2 flat, and that's probably hurt a little bit by Michael's kind of crappy first week there. He's looked better the last few. I think Jones to me is just a little bit better of a runner right now. I probably a little more banged up as well, so maybe that could be the reason why. But that's sort of why I'm feeling a little more inclined to go to Jones after I was really exposed to Michael last week. But I agree, though. I think both guys should be in play. And the discount for Michael is noteworthy given that on a per carry basis, Michael's only getting a handful less carries. So maybe a little bit less good of a back, but also the workload's there. I guess we should talk about the receivers really fast. Any of these guys interesting at all to you after they really didn't run much? Pearson L, his routes have been going down every week, which is kind of concerning, but I guess if you don't need him, why are you putting him out there? The Damian Washington, the guy that we warned about last week, did nothing at all, so he was a play to stay away from. I don't see having these guys, but maybe you do, Sal?
Yeah, no, and so Pearson L, the price point's just very odd on him, and he's the slot wide receiver, so he's the first one coming off the field, not playing a ton of snaps. Washington price point a little bit too high. If you were dying to play somebody maybe on the 2-game slate or in showdown at wide receiver, I'd go to Alonzo Russell at 5,800. He's just seeing a ton of air yards right now. You're probably in line for around 4 to 5 targets out of him. It's on the main 4-game slate. I have no interest, but maybe on a smaller slate, he'd start to pop a little more.
Yeah, I guess if you're playing on FanDuel, certainly you can consider those guys a little bit more, but it still seems like a team that's going to be mostly in a void. They want to run the ball. They should be able to run the ball here. There's really not any reason I would think the pass game gets called in the work here, but tournaments are tournaments. Maybe there's some way to get there. It'll get a little weird, but if you are playing a bunch of lineups for the 2-game slate, Let's go on to game 3 here. And guys, we appreciate the support, so hit the like button. Again, this is a niche sport right now, the XFL. Ratings have been hanging in there, but still, we're trying to make sure this all gets going. And really think this video is going to be helpful for you because as well as my column to Slants and Go, which is up this week for week 4. But again, it was really easy to profit last week, even if you had lineups that didn't make the most sense and had a couple of guys that failed. I do think this week the tournaments are a little bit smaller, but we're probably going to see some overlay again because the interest level in a DFS standpoint seems like it's trickled down a bit. But there is an edge here in the XFL. So hit the like button, watch this video, and I think watch the tournaments closely because there were a lot of tournaments I was profiting in last week and I did not expect. I thought it would fill and they did not. Let's talk game 3 here. Houston heading into Dallas. This to me looks like the marquee game of the week. Over 50 combined points projected in this game. Houston a 2-point favorite on the road. We've talked about Philip Walker and Cam Phillips. Two guys have just been going absolutely nuts together. It does seem, we talked about it last week. It does seem like Cam Phillips is due for some negative regression on his touchdowns. And at his price point, he does need to keep doing what he's done to really have that upside. But I guess even if he had one touchdown with that kind of opportunity, it still would be a guy who's probably the top receiver in the league for the week, especially with Spruce out. So I'm willing to go back to Walker and Phillips. I think Dallas' secondary is not anything I'm too worried about. 59 coverage grade from PFF. The guy that he's facing, I think Josh Hawkins, looks pretty good on paper, only giving up a 23.5 QB rating, but I don't think he's faced anybody like Cam Phillips, who he's not a fast dude, but he finds really good ways to get into space, and he and Walker have a vibe, which I feel like is really unique by both NFL and XFL standards. I'm willing to go back to Phillips and Walker heavy. I can't imagine I'm not going to have these guys in 50% of my lineups this week, Sal, but how do you feel about them?
Yeah, so the only issue is the price if you're trying to get away from the combo of both of them stacking it. I would prefer Phillips over Walker if you're only going to choose one of those guys, just because wide receivers are the most variant and upside position in all of football DFS, and quarterbacks for the most part aren't going to drop 40 like he did last week every week. So even at this price point, if Walker goes down and gets you like 27, 28 fantasy points and you have him, it's fantastic. But if you don't have him and Phillips is going for 35, 38, you're probably going to end up losing. So I just think there's a higher ceiling on a guy like Phillips. So that's where I would lean there. But I think Walker's completely fine. He's attempting 35 attempts per game. He right now has the number 1 overall offensive line. And yeah, he has eyes for Cam Phillips. He's staring him down often and looking for him. I thought the sideline interview was really interesting when they kind of just said that they spend like extra time at practice together. So yeah, Philip Walker at 12,000, there's really nothing bad to say about it. If you can get to it, you're going to probably have to punt at some position, maybe one of your wide receiver spots. So that's where it'll come into play, which 3K guy gets the 10-point game or so. But on the opposite side of it, I do think Landry Jones, this is the game where both quarterbacks look fantastic. The game total is 10 points higher than anywhere else. I do think Landry Jones is very firmly in play, $2,000 less than Phillips. He actually throws in this Dallas offense is throwing 5 more times per game than Houston. So they just want to throw it a ton, not throwing downfield as much, but the overall quantity of the pass attempts keeps him firmly in play for me.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I do think a Dallas stack run back with Cam Phillips is one way to get away from Walker that I'd be okay with. Dallas, a home dog playing against a Houston team who, we saw give up pretty big production to Taylor Cornelius last week, who I would say talent-wise, not in the same stratosphere as Landry Jones. Definitely not an NFL guy like Jones has been. So yeah, I agree. I do think that's one way to get away, but I also think at a certain point, it does feel like it's getting too cute to get away from Walker. And if Dallas can put up points, and I do think they can, it's hard for me to imagine Walker not having a big day here. I'm still going to have heavy Walker, but I think for me, 50% feels like about right of the Walker-Phillips pairing. And then after that, I think I'm willing to get a little bit different, go to Landry Jones as well. But let's finish up the Houston side because Sammy Coats, again, last week had deep targets once again. Routes coming down, though. He only ran 2 more routes than Sam Mobley, a guy who's probably looked better overall. But Coats, to me, is still involved, still getting those deep looks. I think you have to have a little bit of him still, just because he had defensive pass interference last week, had a few missed connections. It's the same story every week with Sammy Coats. But one of these weeks, he's the guy who's most logically going to draw away from Cam Phillips. So I don't know, Sal. How are you feeling about Sammy Coats? You going to take the trap one more time here at some ownership?
I don't know about this week. So right now I actually don't have Coats in a player pool, and I've had him the past 3 weeks. Did not have much of him last week. The first 2 was very heavy, as most people were. But yeah, the price point's coming down. This would be the time to do it. It's just the snap counts that are concerning for me. Now, I don't think what you saw last week is really an indication of definitely going to continue to happen. Last week ended up having Sammy Coats only play 48% of the snaps, and Sam Mobley actually ran ahead of him at 57%. But I do think that, this week, Coats can play the majority and Mobley won't. But I do think that there's going to be a 55-45 or at the very worst 60-40 split there for Coats on the outside. So that's a little bit of a concern. Mobley is one of the really cheap guys on the slate, and it gives you exposure to this game. So I actually think I would prefer getting to Mobley over Coats if you're choosing there. Mobley only 3,400. I have him in a player pool right now. The issue is that Cam Phillips is just so dominant on this team, playing on the outside, and there's a wide receiver rotation of the Mobleys. Blake Jackson's also on the outside for a little bit, and Coats, that it's really hard to get anywhere else. Like you said, for last week, everybody else was just pretty much dust because Khalil Lewis out of the slot's not running high upside routes and he's expensive. Nick Holly's cheap, but he's running like 4 or 5 yards down the field. It doesn't give you much upside. So yeah, for me this week, I think that Cam Phillips and Sam Mobley look really sneaky. Well, Sam Mobley's this really sneaky one.
Yeah, like I'll have some of both Sams, both Sammy and Sam, just because I do think there's room for these guys to do something here. And eventually, like if you look at Cam's numbers, the guys in the chat right now, Kilo Whiskey saying fire Phillips up, talking about how Phillips is similar to Derrick Henry, where you're waiting for the regression, but the regression may never come. David saying Cam Phillips should be in the NFL this fall in the YouTube chat. So shout out these guys in the YouTube chat as well. I think Cam Phillips, I just want to talk about his numbers really fast because they jump off the page. 26% targets per route despite running 37 or 35 routes per game. Like in the NFL, a guy like George Kittle is highly targeted per route. He's at about a 22% rate. So he is being targeted more than a highly targeted tight end. And tight ends also, safer routes generally have higher target per route numbers. It's just like the numbers don't make sense, but then you watch it and you're like, oh, this totally makes sense. And it's kind of one of those things DFS wise where I'll keep being safe. I'll keep playing a lot of Cam. But I feel like something has to give at some point. And if something does give, given the reason that Sal mentioned, the slot guy is not getting a ton of upside. I do think if there is a week where Cam fails, it'll probably be because the production does go to Mobley or Coats. And or maybe this guy, Sal, Jimmy Butler, not the good Jimmy Butler, but a James Butler in the mix. Still getting the majority of the workload there, though Andre Williams did carve out a bit of a role for himself. A Houston team who doesn't run a lot, but one way to get away from the pass game would be if Butler did get some touchdown equity again. Are you going to have any Butler? The price point still looks tough, but I do think if you're not going to play Walker or Phillips in a lineup, I think that you have to maybe get some Butler in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to get different, but at that price point right now, second highest among all running backs, I'll end up getting away from it. The St. Louis guys look better to me just volume wise, and then we're about to get to the Dallas guys, and even they both look better.
No, that seems fair. I'm just trying to think of ways that the obvious part doesn't go off for Houston, but it does seem to me like a situation for all the reasons we talked about. It's just very obvious. It's Walker and Phillips, and that is what's driving Houston right now. And Dallas's defense, the grades are not good, even though again, Josh Hawkins has looked good on paper. I do think that it's still a spot where they haven't faced Houston yet. And when you face Houston, that'll make a lot of men into less than mortals in a lot of situations. Let's go back to the Dallas side. Sal, you talked about Landry Jones a little bit. Who are you pairing with Landry Jones? Because to me last week, Donald Parham was one of my big bailouts. He was chalky, but I was still above the field on him, and he was a monster. One long touchdown really helped out his day, but he was just a dude that was looked for the most by Jones. He's so big too. He's like 6'7", 6'8". He's fast. Like he's shockingly fast for a guy. He's another dude who I would put up. Like Cam Phillips, I would say a fringe NFL prospect, but Parham as a tight end is just kind of a monster. How are you feeling about the receivers here? Because we like Landry Jones, but is Parham your guy, or are you willing to go back to Badette, Nagel, maybe Jazz Ferguson or some of these guys?
Yeah, Parham looks fantastic. I mean, last week, just his breakaway speed compared to cornerbacks and safeties, and I get it, it's the XFL, but he looked legit. I imagine he's going to be on some sort of NFL camp after the XFL is done, but they gave him a huge price bump. Like, I would have imagined he would have been like, even $9,000 flat, I would have said was appropriate, but a lot more than I thought. I was thinking like the 8K range, but yeah, $9,900, second most expensive guy now that Nelson Spruce is going to be out at the wide receiver tight end position. So he would be my first priority to pair with Landry Jones. It then just makes it really difficult to roster Cam Phillips at that point, and he's more of a priority. So I do think Jeff Badette's still fine. He's not seeing as many down the field targets. They're giving those to Josh Crockett right now, and they're also not throwing deep all that much. But in this game that has a higher pace, should run a ton of plays. They're running 72 plays over the last 2 games since Landry Jones has been there. I do think Badette has an upside, especially at what should be lower ownership. You have Trey McBride at the exact same price point. I imagine that's where a lot of the ownership goes. McBride had an uncharacteristically good game on just 11 routes run, where Badette kind of laid an egg at a high ownership number. So I do like Badette in GPPs. I think Parm is completely fine if that's who you want to prioritize. Nagel, Crockett, they're both also in player pools for me and in play. Crockett more so just because he's one of those Sam Mobley, really cheap guys that if he gets you 3 catches for 45 yards, he can end up being enough depending on what he allows for your lineup.
I think for me, Parham's a guy I'll probably go to if I don't have Walker at QB. Like I feel like Jones and Parham would be the stack that I'd want the most out of Dallas. The targets for Parham just are looking good. I mean, 8 targets a game. I agree he's a bit overpriced. I just feel like I'm not buying into Jeff Badet, and maybe you have more insight because I haven't seen the air yards data for week 3 yet. But Badet mostly not getting the deep routes I would have thought, at least from what he did in the previous couple weeks. But as Badet's air yards, are they jumping out so he's being worthwhile? Because he's a speed guy, but he's not getting those deep targets, at least from what I've seen previously.
Yeah, so I'm pulling up his area right now. So I have him. I know that he hasn't been like seeing much there. So pretty much on the season, yeah, last week he had virtually no air yards. I mean, I have him in like the high 40s for air yards last week, which compared to like his teammate Parm is like 30 less than Parm compared to some of the league highs when you're talking about Rashad Ross, McBride, and Phillips all in the 150 yard range. So it's not there. It's been a lot of short, quick passes just in general for this offense. The one guy who's actually seeing passes downfield has been Crockett, but he's not on the field consistently. Like 2 weeks ago, he was on the field for 30 routes. Last week it was in the low 20s.
Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like it just seems like Parham's the safe target. And Badet, he just feels trappy to me, kind of like Mikhail McKay at a similar price point. Just two guys who just have not come through, had a certain pedigree coming in that we assumed would work out for them. But if you're gonna save money, he is a pretty decent discount on Parham, and Parham, I'm sure people will chase that ownership for the same reasons that I will as well. We'll chase that big game last week, and the ownership will probably climb. So it could be a good week to go back to Badet. I'm more intrigued by the run game, Sal, and I'll pitch this to you too. Because of the way these guys are playing together, Cameron Artis-Payne and Lance Dunbar sharing snaps on the field. And also, I thought it was interesting. The commentators pointed it out, but really supporting each other in a meaningful way, which, I mean, it's not the sisterhood of the traveling pants, but it was still like nice to see running backs not getting too competitive about it, happy with their workloads. Both guys getting a good workload. Dunbar really getting targeted an insane amount, still getting rushes. Artis-Payne running more routes, getting targeted less, but still also getting more touches in the rush game. I think you can play these two guys together. I think that's an option that I wouldn't be afraid of this week. Not something I want a ton, but I would slightly favor Dunbar overall because of the PPR value. But how are you feeling about playing these guys together, and I guess individually as well, Sal?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem playing them together. It's probably not my priority option, but I have nothing wrong with that. I'm going to have lineups with it. They are in the best offense for running backs right now. Cameron Artis-Payne is the number 1 running back in routes run, and Lance Dunbar is number 3 at this point. Lance Dunbar leads the entire league in running backs routes out of the slot, and it's at 17, and he ended up running last week 8 out of the slot, so that was good to see. So yeah, he was on the field 61% of the time. Artis-Payne 77% of the time last week, and you just had both of them on the field a good amount, usually when Dunbar was in the slot. So it's just high upside right now. Dunbar's number 1 in the XFL with receptions. He's first in running backs with 23 targets right now, 3rd overall with 53 routes run. So I think he really stands out because his price point didn't come up all that much. And Artis-Payne's at the top, so it starts to become, how do you prioritize your lineups? Are you playing Phillip Walker and Cam Phillips? And if not, well, then you can probably open yourself up to Artis-Payne there. And yeah, I mean, the role's just elite in the best game environment. It's not even like they're underdogs by that much. It's a 1-point spread, pretty much a pick 'em. So I think both of these running backs on Dallas overall, I think they're my 2 favorite plays from the Dallas side.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, adjusting for price and all that, like I like Parham. We can't extol the virtues of Parham enough, but at his price point, I mean, Artis-Payne and Dunbar feel like safer plays to me by far. And Dunbar is just looking good as a slot guy and as a running back. And Artis-Payne been a good yards after contact guy, getting 3.9 yards after contact per touch. So he's been a bit of a bulldozer as well. And again, these guys are on the field a lot. I mean, the snap counts for both guys are pretty heavy. I really do like both guys. I agree, though, it's not a priority to get both, but I do think for a GPP approach, having both in a lineup is going to make you real different. And not having Parham as well, I think that combination to me, I'll have in some tournament lineups for sure. I guess anybody else here we should hit on? And yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything worthwhile that we haven't touched, but I think we covered everything. Anything else for you, Sal, in this Dallas-Houston game?
No, I think that, so really just to close the door on the wide receivers. Yeah, Parham's my favorite option. And then it gets really murky. The running backs I would prefer. Flynn Nagel's more of a cash play for me. He's just on the field a ton. 98% of the routes so far this year are out of the slot, but they're not high or they're not downfield targets. But he's a nice price point, so didn't really talk about him much, but he's going to have a great role. It's just very similar to Nick Holley, and they're probably going to see 5 or 6 targets. If they don't get in the end zone, they're probably not needed.
Yeah, the slot coverage too. Dietrich Nichols is the main guy in the slot so far, and he's been a guy who hasn't looked that great. QB rating of 79 on the year, but seems like that's due for some better results overall. Probably just hasn't given up any touchdowns, but he's given up a lot of work overall and hasn't been good when he's defending on the outside. So I do think one of Parham or Nagel's going to have a pretty good opportunity in the slot. Guys, hit the like button again. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, with our helpful reminder from our editor-in-chief, Nolan, we are doing this on podcast form. We have a special giveaway going right now for our podcast listeners. All you have to do is check out the pinned tweet on @awesemo_com, giving away free months of Awesemo Plus to people who rate the podcast feed of ours, the Awesemo podcast feed, where all of our content comes through right after it airs. You can go do that right now. Give us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts, and there are details on how you could win a free month of Awesemo Plus on the pinned tweet on @awesemo_com when you do that. So it helps us out, helps you out. So please do that right now. Check out the pinned tweet on @awesemo_com. All right, game 4 here, the last game of the slate. DC heading into a matchup with Tampa Bay. And DC, the disappointment of last week by far. DeAndre Tompkins, also a massive disappointment for me. He and Parham were guys I was really heavy on with where their prices were. Tompkins seemed like he meaningfully lost work to Rashad Ross, who ran his most routes so far. Eli Rogers still heavily in the mix, but Carla Jones just looked pretty bad in that game. A guy who looked good the first few weeks at home. On the road, a much different story, but he's also heading west, some different variables there. How are you feeling about this DC squad this week, Sal? It was a terrible game for them last week, but they are a team who we thought would be strong this year and who's been looking pretty good besides that complete debacle at LA.
Yeah, I think that we'll chalk that one up to just being an outlier, but I have no idea what went on there. Carla Jones was the lowest graded passer last week out of like the 11 quarterbacks used. And on the season, that was the 3rd worst performance out of any quarterback that's thrown a pass attempt, even if you've only thrown like 3 in a game. Like Jalen McClendon week 1 was worse, but he was really bad. The offense overall was terrible. I don't really know what to take away from it other than maybe just sort of a reality check for them after they were sort of the number 1 team in pretty much every power rankings. Everybody was riding the Carla Jones high horse, but I still think he's an elite quarterback, probably NFL ready wise, the number 1 in this league. So he's not as intriguing as that Houston-Dallas game and those players, but I do think he's firmly in play this week at 9,900 for what should be relatively lower ownership. When you're talking cash games, I'm not going to get there, but he's sort of a pivot if you wanted to in GPPs off of, I imagine, Walker and Jones, who should be pretty chalky.
Yeah, and Cardale's running enough too where he gives you a little bit of upside. I mean, 3 rushes per game, but a decent yardage overall with a little bit over 20 yards per game on the run game. And I don't mind Cardale. I think with this price down and after a terrible game like that, maybe it's a week to go back. But like I like Eli Rogers in the slot. I do think he's a good player. I think he's been decent, but he hasn't spiked a big upside. Rashad Ross to me seems like the dude I would want to stack with Jones the most, but I feel like a one-off Ross also looks fine. How are you feeling about the wide receiving core here, Sal? Do you want to buy back into Tompkins, or are you buying the fact that Ross might have just supplanted him?
Yeah, so Malachi Dupree is going to return probable, but week 2, all these guys were healthy. Tompkins was maybe limited when he had his big week, and Dupree barely played any snaps, partially because he got hurt, but I still think Dupree is firmly going to be the number 4 guy here. The only downside is now he might work in more for Rashad Ross and Tompkins, so that's something to at least keep an eye on. But I think this is the most interesting wide receiver group because they're all pretty fairly priced. There's not one who stands out above the rest. It's sort of a week-to-week thing. You've seen Rashad Ross right now. He's number 2 in the entire XFL in air yards. He's number 1 in deep attempts his way of 20-plus yards. So I do like Rashad Ross. I want to say the most when it comes to GPPs at 8,700, but I have all 3 of them in a player pool. You're going to get the most consistency out of Rodgers. Led the team in targets last week, 99 more snaps out of the slot, so that's pretty solid. You're probably in line for 7 to 8 targets out of Rodgers. Ross, more times than not, it's not going to go above 6, but most of them will be downfield with high upside. So Ross is probably the guy I like the most in GPPs. DeAndre Tompkins at 5,200. He ran more routes last week. We'll see if Dupree cuts into that. He ran 29. I still think there's upside there. Just the issue now that this team is completely healthy, it's harder to want to get there. The price point is the thing that makes it the most appealing. So all 3 I have right now. To rank it for GPPs, I'd probably go Ross, Tompkins, Rodgers.
I think that's fair. I find it tough with Tompkins because he looked so good that first week and then he just barely saw any looks last week. And again, that was just such a bad game by DC where maybe just throw that one out entirely. But Ross getting the 31 routes to Tompkins is 29. I just feel like Ross is on the upswing there, whereas Tompkins, just talent-wise, maybe not quite in the same league as Ross. But I do agree, though. I feel like if you were going to stack a QB with 2 receivers, this to me would be the team that I think you can actually pull that off with and maybe spike an upside. But I just think rotating the 3 in, but I agree with your ranking though. I feel like Ross being number 1 seems fair. Eli Rogers, I just think has to have a better day at some point, but he might be kind of a Flynn Nagel where He's just kind of in the slot, not getting the big targets deep downfield, maybe not spiking an upside in a meaningful way. How about the run game, Sal? Because the run game here for DC did do well, mostly in garbage time, but also Jarrell Presley really getting phased out of the mix. Guys like Khalil Abdullah and Nick Brissett had pretty good games in the garbage time of that one. Brissett in particular really carved up the LA defense when nothing mattered at all. But Pumphrey seems like the qualified lead back here. I guess I don't know for sure, though, that'll be the case with how Brissett looked. But how are you feeling about DC's run game? Do you see having any of these guys at all?
Yeah, so the way that I have it set up right now, I'm just pulling up their run game. I have Pumphrey, the guy that I project still to see at like worst 50% of the snaps as long as the game stays close. Most upside. I don't want any of these guys when it comes to cash, but I do have Pumphrey mainly for like a GPP player pool at 6,500. I do think he's at least interesting. Not as elite in the passing game as like the Dallas Spags and Lance Dunbar, but he is one of 5 guys in the league to run 30 or more routes at the running back position, or 35 or more routes at the running back position. You're seeing him run out of the slot as well often. He's ran about 8 routes out of the slot, which is number 2 in the league behind Dunbar. So he has a really good role on this team. It's just a matter of how many running backs are they willing to use. Now that you saw last week in garbage time, some of the other guys ended up getting active and going if they take that and run with it a little bit more. So there's definitely a risk, which makes it not much of a cash play. Don't really know how much they're going to use Abdullah moving forward, but him or Brissett, I wouldn't be shocked if they use them in the backfield for a couple of snaps a game. Probably impacts Presley, so he's out of play for me. Pumphrey's the guy that I'll have in a player pool for GPP, and I think he has some upside.
Yeah, I would agree there. Like if I have anybody here, it'll probably be Pumphrey, but even him, I'm not that bullish on. It just feels like a backfield that's going to get more crowded instead of less, even though Presley being out of the mix, kind of disappointing, but he just hasn't looked like the same dude he did in the AAF, and could be a variety of factors, but a tough situation for him. It does seem like he's pretty much getting squeezed out. Tampa Bay side, we talked a little about the QB situation earlier. Taylor Cornelius expected to start now, according to Sal, being on the ball there with all the important Tampa Bay Vipers news. But Tampa Bay, another team, good home crowd last week, really brought it as best they could against Houston. They were clearly not in the same ballpark talent-wise, but they did what they could to hang in there. I thought Cornelius was fairly impressive. He responded well. We talked about this before we came on the air, but Cornelius getting in the game pretty much, or getting taken out of the game because the crowd was booing him lustfully on every snap to get Quentin Flowers in. Quentin Flowers now not with the team for personal reasons, but Cornelius looking like he's going to start again, even though Aaron Murray's been back in practice. I don't mind Cornelius. I felt like he showed me something in that last game. DC's defense, though, probably a little better than they showed versus LA. So, if I get some Cornelius, I don't mind. But how do you feel about the QB situation here for Tampa Bay?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting play in really all formats at $7,000 in cash. If you're trying to just load up on the studs at running back and wide receiver, I don't think it's terrible. In GPPs, you saw him less than 1% owned in contests, scoring 23 points last week. It's just I might lean more towards it in cash, but it's interesting because there's no Quentin Flowers. He's not going to be with the team, so that's good for Cornelius. He should be on the field more. And if he's struggling, then Aaron Murray might come in. But if he's struggling, you're probably not going to win anyways. So I do think it's an interesting play at $7,000. He's probably the one punt quarterback that I'd go to. I'll preface that by saying that I'd rather get to the more expensive guys if you're building like 1 to 3 lineups. But if you're building a good amount of lineups, I think you can make some really strong lineups as long as Cornelius can get you somewhere around like that 18 plus point threshold.
Yeah, Cornelius, I do think, he's a guy who looked fairly competent out there. He's got a 66% accuracy rating on the year, which is not bad by XFL standards. Does seem like he also was really looking Jalen Tolliver's way. I was going to be more bullish on Dan Williams if Aaron Murray were in, because I thought that Murray really favored Williams over Tolliver. But I do think Tolliver would be the guy I would want to go to with Cornelius back in there. But how do you feel about it, Sal? Because we talked about Tolliver. We talked about him being a guy kind of seeming like he was due for more of a breakout with him running the same amount of routes as Williams. Now I feel like it's kind of swung the other way, where Tolliver had the monster game, put up 100 yards, got 8 grabs in that last game, really looked strong, but Williams is very much involved as well, had a touchdown in that game. How would you lean between both Williams and Tolliver?
Yeah, so I think just factoring in the price point, they both look pretty strong. All 3 of these receivers, even Horn out of the slot, look really good this week. I'll probably lean to Tolliver the most just when you factor in the price point here, but I like all of them. I think Reese Horn out of the slot, he ran 85% of the snaps last week. That looks strong. His role out of the slot is probably the one to go the least unhindered. You have both of those guys playing 100% of the snaps in Dan Williams and Tolliver on the outside last week, but they did just re-sign Centavius Jones, who week 1 was like projected to maybe be the number 1 receiver. They cut him. They just re-signed him according to the XFL transactions page. So it's interesting to see if he'll really be a factor. The fact that they cut him, I don't really think he'll cut into too much of the workload. So I'd probably rank it Tolliver, Horn, and then Williams just because of the price points and what we've seen out of the role. But they're running so many plays on offense. These three guys rank in the top 4 for routes run in the entire league. So it's very similar to the NFL Arizona Cardinals for like the first month or two of the season. All of their wide receivers were running a ton of routes. That's what's happening right now. So there's a lot of opportunity what you're seeing in Tampa.
I'm a little bit less bullish on Horn just because Shamarko Thomas is a guy who I do know the name from the NFL. He's got a very memorable name, but also he's been the guy who's been covering the slot a little bit more. So kind of jumped out more in terms of the routes he was covering last week. And he really shut down everything that went his way. He's covering 14 and a half slot routes per game and gave up just a 29 QB rating last week. So a dude who's really done a good job shutting down. With Reese Horn, to me, I feel like Reese Horn talent-wise is not there with Tolliver and Williams. And probably with Shantavius Jones, he was a bit of a bigger body. It saw some speed. I think Horn to me is the dude I'm least interested in out of the group, but I think a mix here seems fair. And I agree. I didn't actually know that they picked up Shantavius Jones. I was wondering why he was still in the player pool. But he was a guy who did have a pretty big workload the last time he played. But I would agree, you don't cut a guy and bring him back and give him a big workload, one would think, especially with Tolliver and Williams having proven themselves a bit more. Talk about the running backs here, Sal, because Davion Smith reclaimed a bit more of the timeshare with Jock Patrick last week. Smith was 50-50 the week before that, so it's noteworthy to have him getting more of a role here. Going against DC, the run defense isn't great. Smith keeps getting the work. Do you see having any Davion Smith or maybe Jock Patrick this week?
Yeah, both of the running backs are GPP only plays the way that I have them ranked right now. So I think they're in play. They're like tertiary or secondary options, similar to Pumphrey for me this week. I think their price points are interesting in there. The thing that stands out the most is that you have Christian Michael in St. Louis at a similar price point as like Davion Smith. So it's hard for me to not at least have interest in Davion Smith because they're both in backfields that are only using 2 running backs. Yeah, St. Louis is running the ball a ton, but Michael's been wildly inaccurate or ineffective, and he's the number 2 running back there when Davion Smith's the number 1. So just the way that I compare it that way, it makes me interested still in Davion Smith from a GPP perspective. Have him projected for 14 total touches right now, have Jock Patrick at 9. So I think they're both at least in play.
Yeah, I agree. I think they seem okay enough. I would also favor Davion Smith as well. And I think that logic makes sense about him being at the same price point as Christine Michael. And Tampa Bay just runs a ton of plays. They're running the most plays in the league, a little bit over 73 per game. So they're looking actually 72 per game, excuse me. So they're looking pretty good in terms of the volume. You know, DC does seem that defense was good before they got completely blown up by LA, and maybe Trey McBride's just a special kind of beast. And it won't be the same case for Tampa Bay this week. But I do think you have to have some exposure there. And so definitely some ways to go about these lineups. All right, so we talked about everything, Sal, and guys, hit that like button. Anything else you want to touch on before we call it quits? Actually, we should talk about defenses. Any defenses jumping out to you as being particularly worthwhile? I would say for me, St. Louis has to be the one that jumps out, whatever the price point. But we saw that not work out for Houston last week, so who knows?
Yeah, I mean, DraftKings was on it this week. St. Louis is at 5,100, which it makes it difficult depending on how you build your lineups because of how they priced up really all the viable or the guys who've been consistent in Parham and Artis Payne and Walker and Phillips. So they're my favorite defense as a team that only has a 13 implied total against them. And they're a 12-point spread. So you imagine with a good secondary, they'll be able to force some sort of turnover against a not that great of a quarterback play right now. But I also think LA stands out. Their coverage unit grades right now for Pro Football Focus, number 1 against what might be a rotating door at quarterback for New York this week. And LA at this point is actually favorably priced just relative to the Battlehawks. They're 4,500. But there's no reason not to want to punt. I mean, you have all the way down at the bottom. Dallas is 3,000 against Houston. It's not great because of the total, but you know Houston's going to throw 35 plus times in this game. If there's any mistakes to be made, you're going to have at least a lot more opportunities to try and capitalize on it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And certainly defense is not a thing to go out of your way to pay up for. And St. Louis being that highly priced, not a great spot, but I do feel like they're a team that, I don't know, it's just hard to imagine Seattle doing much going on the road against St. Louis. And, you know, who knows? Who knows how you're going to make all these prices work, but it's going to be a fun week again. Lots of upside for all you guys. So, Sal, anything else you want to touch on before we call it quits for this week for another XFL week where hopefully there'll be overlay and lots of easy ways to make money?
So I guess the last thing, just from the transaction list, you had Amartey Edwards, who was a NFL wide receiver. He actually signed with Dallas. I'm not sure if he'll be active this week. Pretty similar to SJ Green. So maybe not something to look at. He's not in the player pool right now, but I doubt they'll add it. But The other thing is that Tanner Gentry was activated off of the short-term IR list for New York. He was listed as a starter week 1, or was supposed to be. So again, don't know the run that these guys are going to get. Just kind of monitor that. Gentry would be the guy that in the player pool that you could actually probably play, but he should be limited. Just going to point that out. Lastly is Nick Truesdale has not practiced yet this week. So if he's out, even more upside for Reese Horn in Tampa.
And DeAndre Goolsby, who did nothing with his routes last week, but has a fun, spooky sounding name that I would enjoy. Sal, any plugs for you? And of course, at Sal Vetri DFS, follow you for all the content you're doing, but anything else you want to plug?
Nope. Yeah, that's all. You can follow me on Twitter at Sal Vetri DFS, and best of luck in week 4.
All right, follow me at Chris Spags. Again, use that promo code football is back at osmo.com/join. That'll give you half off of some of the weekly packages we have on there. The XFL package is also on for the full season and for the weeklies, I believe. So go check out osmo.com/join and find a package that'll work for you. And also, again, check out that pinned tweet on at osmo_com. All you have to do is give our podcast feed on Apple Podcasts 5 stars and a review. And there are details on there. I think you just have to leave your Osmo username when doing it. But check the pinned tweet first and leave your podcast review. It helps us out and it'll give you a shot to win a free month of Osmo Plus. So go check them out right now at osmo.com, or actually osmo_com on Twitter. We appreciate you guys watching. Hit the like button before you go. And we'll be back next week, and hopefully my brain will function a little bit better after doing all the NBA content this morning. But appreciate you guys watching. See you again soon. Enjoy your weekends. Bye, guys.